Hello and welcome back to the Week in Sustainability. I am Melissa Raid, your host today, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life. I come to you solo this week. I have no compadres or compatriots to join me, but what I do have are two amazing stories about what happened in sustainability this week. So I'm going to talk to you today about two things. One, an overview of COP15, the global summit on biodiversity that wrapped in Montreal, as well as a new proposed law in the EU for a carbon import tariff. So let's kick it off with COP. What are we talking about here? This is the Conference of the Parties gathering, convening of global governments to discuss biodiversity. Now, to set the stage, I'm going to start with some opening remarks by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who really set the stage with his own opening on humanity's war on nature is ultimately a war on ourselves. And isn't that true? He had some colorful language, as he often does, to describe our relationship with nature as a cacophony of chaos and an orgy of destruction. So let's roll it back to this global conference and talk about what progress was made and, frankly, what it's all about. So COP15, this was a convening of global governments that is looking to establish a formal set of goals around how do we interact with nature. It was first established in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, and the convention is all about promoting sustainable development and rests on the very critical realization that biological diversity, it's more than just plants and animals and microorganisms and ecosystems. It's really about us. It's about people and humanity and our reliance on natural systems for things like food security, medicine, fresh air, clean water, shelter, etc. Now, the convention has 7 primary themes that reflect various biomes of Earth and their associated services. So think wetlands, mountains, agriculture, forests, marine, etc. Now, where we are in terms of biodiversity, comparing this to where we are with COP related to climate, we just had COP27 in Egypt this past year. So this is COP15 for biodiversity, just to give you a scale of, we're essentially 5 to 10 years earlier talking about biodiversity and natural services as we are in relation to climate. And so this may be a new topic for a lot of our listeners. To that effect, there's actually no formal requirements underpinning this convention. Where they're at in the negotiations is really broad acknowledgement that this is a problem. We need substantial investments in the natural world and conserving those services and systems that we rely on so much as humanity. Investments are always a key theme in these COPs. And so there was actually a full day that was dedicated to exploring the relationship between financial systems and the economy and biodiversity. We have nowhere near figured out the math, frankly, of pricing natural systems and services. And so that's a lot of what is hoped to achieve at this conference so that we can then, of course, create policies and regulatory frameworks and commitment and goals all around protecting biodiversity. So what was the agenda all about? Similar to how the climate COP in Egypt this past year was underscored with a little bit of awkwardness given the political and activist climate in Egypt, this COP was similarly underscored by protests of indigenous leaders, essentially saying, if you want to protect biodiversity, stop invading our lands. And I do think that is a meaningful anecdote to share. So this convention, much like the climate COPs, it's split into 2 zones, an upper level and a lower level, much like the blue and green zones of the climate COPs. And so you have a dedicated zone where all of the negotiations are taking place, all of the government leaders occupy that zone. And then you have another zone that has civic communities, business and finance, academics, really more of the periphery community that's taking place and participating in these conversations. So the overall goal of COP15, what are they all here to talk about? It really all pinned together by the goal of halting biodiversity loss by 2030 and living in nature by 2050. So if these kinds of goals sound similar to how we think about the climate COP of net zero by 2050 and interim goals by 2030, you can see some of the parallel thinking and frameworks of how it's being approached in biodiversity. So now ever present, as I said in the agenda, was a relationship between finance and the economy and pricing in these natural resources. Just as investors have very much realized the material financial impact of climate change related to risks and opportunities, they're similarly waking up, frankly, to that very same link between biodiversity and biological services and the economy. So there was a deal that was reached at the end of this COP. I'm going to run you through some of the key takeaways. So going towards that 30 by 30 goal, we're talking about protecting 30% of land and 30% of coastal and marine areas and restoring 30% of land and water by 2030. So it's 30, 30, 30. We're using a lot of round numbers here. The financing component, there was an agreement that annually $200 billion of funds from both public and private sources should be going into conservation initiatives, with a goal of wealthier countries contributing 20 billion annually by 2025 and bringing that up to $30 billion annually by 2030. Don't get your hopes up for this. There is a bit of a trend in us in these global climate and biodiversity negotiations of saying and acknowledging we need to create these funds, and then not really walking the walk. The money doesn't quite materialize. But moving on, there were also some corporate discussions on corporate reporting requirements on biodiversity and the issues around that for large company and financial institutions. So again, we've talked in previous podcasts here about TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. This is what we're talking about here, of having corporates and financial institutions talk about how they affect biodiversity and how biodiversity, frankly, affects them when it comes to financially their bottom line. There was also a lot of conversations on harmful subsidies. So essentially identifying subsidies that deplete biodiversity and having those be identified by 2025, and then a plan to phase out, eliminate, or reform them so that they no longer do harm. A lot of talk also on pollution and pesticides. This was one of the weaker components of the bill, and language was pretty loose, frankly, about reducing the harmful impact of pesticides and pollution on nature. Not a whole lot of teeth in that, unfortunately. And then, of course, lastly, we had monitoring and reporting on progress. So very similarly to how on the climate side, we have those NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for greenhouse gas emission reductions, basically setting out a similar framework where nations will submit similar action plans around biodiversity. Again, we're very early in the biodiversity conversation, so there's not a lot of deadlines, there's not a lot of quantitative goals or real plans. What we're really talking about in these conferences is aligning on assumptions and frameworks and overarching intentions. So that one is certainly sure to continue. We will most definitely keep you posted on what goes on with biodiversity and TNFD, and frankly, our relationship in the corporate environment to acknowledging and pricing and interacting with the natural environment. All right, moving on, let's shift it to the regulatory environment. So I'm going to talk to you about the European carbon import tariff. And this is a really quick who, what, where, when, why, and how. So we've got the European Union once again leading on climate legislation and regulatory environment. And what have they done? They've struck a preliminary agreement. So this is not a law, but this is a preliminary agreement to have a law with some meat to it. But that is imposing a carbon dioxide emissions tariff on imports. And so this is focused on hard to abate sectors. This is for things like steel, iron, chemical fertilizer, aluminum, electricity, basically those hard to abate sectors. And what they're doing is they are going to assign an import tariff for those goods that come into the EU that essentially are coming from countries that have lesser or weaker environmental regulations around those goods and services. So why are they doing this? The aim of the tax is to prevent European industry from being essentially undercut by cheaper goods that come from regions with weaker environmental laws. Applying this kind of import tariff supports the domestic industries that are hard to abate and kind of props up the EU's own industry, while also, frankly, acting as a carrot for the international community to create policies of similar rigor so that we can all fight in this global climate change fight. So this is just another example, frankly, of using regulation to create market forces that will help transition to a net zero economy. So at a very high level, how it's going to work is companies that are importing goods to the EU are going to have to buy certificates to cover essentially the embodied carbon emissions of their product. That unit cost of carbon is going to be the same cost that domestic companies already have to pay if they go above the carbon cap that's been in Europe for years. And so again, this is kind of leveling the playing field. This is saying, for example, if cement in the EU is more expensive because they have to do things to make that a lower carbon product because of these regulatory requirements, and it would be cheaper to buy cement that's full of carbon and hasn't had any decarbonization effort from an international market, we're going to actually level the playing field by imposing this import tariff so that it can drive and support the decarbonization of the industry. So are there any exclusions to this? Yes, if you didn't hear it already. One of them is that the import tariff will only apply to regions that have weaker environmental regulations. So you could say, if you were a country like the US, there is a little bit of skepticism where even though we do not have as strong environmental regulations, there could be some industry push. It's a little bit subjective to kind of claim that we do and thus have the import tariff removed. So when the law is expected to be approved by the member states by the end of the year and by European Parliament in early 2023 and go into effect in October that same year, October 2023. Like all major regulations, there will be a phase-in period. And so this will be expected to go into full force in 2026, 2027. So still certainly plenty of time to see how this proposal evolves, but incredibly exciting to see carbon pricing and this kind of import tariff and pricing mechanism go into effect at such a large and broad scale. So applause to the EU this week. That is what I have for you this week. Those are our top stories. We will be taking next week off for the holidays. We wish you all a happy and healthy, and we will see you again in 2023 with top news in sustainability. Thanks so much.